The deepest cold is not in the air, but in the soul. The greatest monster in North America was not imported, but born from its own frozen heart. This is the Wendigo, an Algonquian spirit of endless hunger and winter itself. By the end of this, you will understand how an ancient warning about starvation became a timeless symbol for the monster within us all. We will trace its path from sacred folklore to shocking true crime and see how it now haunts our stories and our world. What does it mean when a legend begins to feel real? We start in the vast, whispering forests of the north, where the idea of the Wendigo first took root among the people who knew that land best. Its origins are not in a single beast, but in a profound spiritual understanding of a dangerous world. To the Algonquian peoples, the Wendigo was never just a monster in the woods. It was a fundamental law of the universe written in ice and hunger. This concept, known as Witikau in Cree, existed across countless communities from the Great Lakes to the eastern woodlands, a shared nightmare for those who understood the true price of survival. The core idea was universal, a dark reflection of their world. Imagine the homeland that birthed this belief, a sea of endless pine and spruce stretching to the horizon, where winters were not merely seasons but existential trials. The snow could bury a man in hours, and the silence between the trees was a profound, waiting emptiness. In such a place, starvation was not a vague fear, but a constant, whispering companion. The Wendigo became the personification of that companion. It was the spirit of the winter wind that stole your warmth, the famine that emptied the cooking pot, and most critically, the ultimate taboo born from that famine, cannibalism. This is the crucial, chilling layer. The Wendigo was not merely an external predator. It was a spiritual corruption, a sickness of the soul. In the old stories, a person did not just encounter a Wendigo, they could become one. The transformation often began with a desperate, unthinkable act, consuming human flesh to survive a harsh winter. But that act was a door swinging open, inviting the Wendigo spirit to take up residence inside them. It was a curse of insatiable hunger, where the more you consumed, the more you craved, until your humanity was hollowed out and replaced by an endless, freezing want. So the legend served a dual purpose. It explained the terrifying forces of nature, and it enforced the most sacred social law, forbidding the act that could unravel a community from the inside out. This was not a simple campfire tale to scare children. It was a profound cautionary myth about the monster we are all capable of becoming when pushed to the absolute brink. And as European settlers pushed into those same frozen forests, they would hear these stories and carry them back, where the Wendigo would begin a strange and terrifying new chapter, stepping out of folklore and into the realm of reported fact. This spiritual corruption did not stay invisible. It took on a form that could freeze the blood of anyone who saw it. The classic Wendigo is a walking, breathing portrait of starvation pushed beyond any human limit. It is often described as a towering skeletal giant, standing as high as 15 feet tall, a gaunt silhouette against the winter pines. Its skin is stretched paper thin over its bones, pulled so tight it takes on a grayish, corpse-like pallor. In the deep shadows of the forest, its only distinct features would be its eyes, said to glow with a malevolent, yellowish light like banked coals in the dark. But the most horrifying detail is its mouth. Its lips are frequently described as chewed away, ragged and bloody, a grotesque testament to its own insatiable craving, as if it had tried to consume itself in its madness. Every part of its form screams of deprivation. Its limbs are elongated and bony, moving with an unnatural, jerking speed across the snow. And those who claim to have encountered it speak of a smell that precedes it, an overwhelming stench of rot and corruption, the smell of a grave in the deep cold. This is the crucial point. Its body is not just scary, it is symbolic. Every element of the Wendigo's appearance is a direct physical manifestation of the hunger it embodies. It is not a monster that is hungry, it is hunger itself given a shape and a purpose. The stretched skin shows the emptiness within. The glowing eyes reflect a fire that consumes but never warms. The mangled mouth shows a hunger that turns inward, destroying the self in the process. It is famine personified, a lesson from a harsh world made into a nightmare that walks. This terrifying figure, born from sacred law and winter's warning, would soon step out of the realm of pure myth and into the pages of settler diaries and colonial newspapers, where it would be given a new name and a chilling new kind of reality. Yet this terrifying form is merely the shell, the physical echo of something far more profound. To understand the Wendigo is to look past the glowing eyes and skeletal frame and into its spiritual essence. At its core, the Wendigo is not a beast you can hunt. It is a malevolent force, a spirit of pure hunger that seeks a host. This is where the legend becomes truly chilling, for the most common way to become a Wendigo is not to be attacked by one, but to invite it in through a desperate human act. In the old teachings, if a person, driven to the brink by famine and cold, committed the ultimate taboo of consuming human flesh, they opened a door. The Wendigo spirit would seize that moment of moral collapse and enter them, beginning a process of possession. This is not a simple curse, it is a spiritual sickness, a corruption that rewrites the soul. Within some Algonquian understandings, this condition has a name: Wendigo psychosis. It describes a person consumed by an insatiable greed, a hunger that specifically craves human flesh, but more broadly represents a bottomless desire for anything, wealth, power, resources, that destroys their connection to others. The victim's humanity is hollowed out, replaced by a freezing, all-consuming want. And here lies the most potent symbol of this transformation. The heart of the afflicted person is said to turn to ice. This is not a metaphor for being cold-hearted in the casual sense. It is a literal spiritual freezing, the complete loss of compassion, empathy, and the warmth of community. A person with a heart of ice cannot feel love, cannot share, cannot recognize the humanity in others. They see only meat to sate a hunger that can never be filled. This makes the Wendigo legend one of the most powerful cautionary tales ever conceived. It is not merely a warning about monsters in the dark woods, it is a warning about the dark woods within ourselves. It teaches that the greatest threat to a community is not the winter outside, but the winter that can grow inside a person, the selfishness and greed that, once embraced, turns you into a predator of your own people. The physical monster is frightening, but the idea that we could become that monster, that is a truth that echoes far beyond any forest. And this terrifying idea would not remain confined to oral tradition. As the 19th century unfolded, reports began to surface that seemed to blur the line between myth and a horrifying new reality. The path to becoming a Wendigo was a one-way journey with a single, terrible toll. At its heart, the transformation was a direct consequence of breaking the most sacred law of survival in a harsh world, the taboo against cannibalism. In the deep Algonquian forests, where a bad hunt or an early blizzard could mean the difference between life and death for an entire family group, this was not an abstract moral rule. It was the foundational glue that held society together. To eat another person, even in the most desperate circumstances of starvation, was to unravel that social fabric at its core. The Wendigo myth made the spiritual cost of that action terrifyingly concrete. If you consumed human flesh to save your own life, you did not just commit a crime, you invited a curse. You risked becoming the very force of consumption you sought to escape. Classic stories often begin with a lone hunter, separated from his group by a sudden white-out blizzard. Days pass, his supplies vanish, and the gnawing void in his stomach becomes all he can think about. In his delirium, the unthinkable begins to seem logical. Perhaps he comes upon the frozen body of a fellow traveler. The temptation in that moment of absolute weakness is the point of no return. The act itself is the key that unlocks the door, allowing the Wendigo spirit to enter and begin its work of possession. But the door could also be opened in other ways. Some narratives tell of a person who simply dreams of the Wendigo, a vivid, haunting visitation where the spirit chooses them. Upon waking, they find their own humanity slowly draining away, replaced by a chilling aversion to warmth and a new, unsettling craving. In yet another interpretation, the Wendigo did not need famine as an excuse. It was attracted to a moral famine already present. A person consumed by greed, by gluttony, or by a selfishness that placed their own desires above the needs of the community could also become a target. The spirit would amplify those existing traits into monstrous proportions, turning a greedy heart into a literally insatiable one. Whether through desperate action, spiritual selection, or moral failure, the result was the same: a new Wendigo was created. This established the creature not as a random predator, but as a direct consequence, a living punishment for abandoning the principles that made human life possible in an unforgiving land. It was a story that taught, in the starkest terms imaginable, that some lines once crossed change you forever. And as European settlers moved into these territories, they would hear these stories, but filtered through their own fears and misunderstandings, they would begin to record something startling: alleged encounters with these beings in the flesh. Its powers were as terrifying as its form, a set of supernatural abilities that made it the perfect, unstoppable predator of the North Woods. This was no mere animal to be outrun or outsmarted. It was a force of nature given malicious intent. First and foremost was its impossible speed and strength. Witnesses described it moving across the deep snow not with effort, but with a terrifying, skittering grace, covering distances in moments that would take a human days to traverse. Its skeletal limbs held a strength that could shatter trees and tear apart log cabins as if they were made of kindling. To be chased by a Wendigo was a hopeless prospect, for nothing in the forest could match its pace. Its senses were equally superhuman, particularly its sense of smell. It was said to be able to catch the scent of a living human from miles away, cutting through the clean, pine-scented air to find the warm, salty promise of flesh. A hunter hiding in a cave or a trapper huddled in his lonely cabin was not safe, only perfectly concealed. But perhaps its most insidious power was one of deception. Some stories tell of the Wendigo's ability to mimic human voices. A traveler lost in a blizzard might hear the familiar, desperate call of a loved one, or the calm, guiding voice of a fellow hunter, only to follow that sound deeper into the wilderness and straight into the creature's waiting grasp. This power to exploit hope and trust made it a psychological predator as much as a physical one, yet its most defining trait was its near invulnerability. Conventional weapons were useless against it. Bullets would pass through its papery skin as if through mist, and steel blades would not bite into its frozen flesh. The legends are very specific. Only two things could truly harm a Wendigo: the purifying power of fire, or the sacred intervention of a spiritual elder performing a ritual of banishment. This was because the creature was not truly physical. It was a spiritual corruption and thus required a spiritual or elemental cure, and wherever it walked, it brought the essence of its origin with it. Its very presence could summon an unnatural, localized cold, dropping the temperature instantly, freezing the breath in your lungs, or whipping the snow into a sudden, blinding blizzard. This was not coincidence, it was a manifestation. The Wendigo did not just come from the winter, it carried the heart of winter within it, spreading that deadening, life-stealing chill to everything it touched. To face a Wendigo was to face the frozen famine of the deep woods given a will, a consciousness, and a single, horrifying purpose. So how do you stop a creature that feels no pain and fears no blade? The legends are very clear. You do not fight a Wendigo with the weapons of man, but with the elements and wisdom of the spirit. The first and most potent weapon is fire. This is not a tactical choice, it is a symbolic annihilation. The Wendigo is the embodiment of winter's deepest cold, a being whose heart is literally made of ice. Fire represents its absolute opposite, the warmth of community, the life-giving heat of the sun, the controlled power of transformation. To burn a Wendigo is to attack its very essence, to thaw the spiritual corruption that holds it together. In many tales, only a blaze hot enough to completely consume the creature's form can end its torment, reducing the frozen monster to ashes and finally releasing the trapped spirit within. Some stories mention silver, that ancient folkloric metal believed to have purifying properties against unnatural beings. A bullet or blade of pure silver might bite where lead and steel would not, but even this is often seen as a temporary measure, a way to wound or drive it off, not to achieve a final victory. That victory, according to the old ways, almost always requires spiritual intervention. This is not a battle for a lone hunter, but a task for a person of deep knowledge, a medicine elder or a person chosen by the spirits themselves. The process is one of exorcism, not extermination. The goal is to drive the Wendigo spirit out of its host, to separate the corruption from the human soul it has claimed. This might involve complex rituals, sacred songs, the burning of special herbs, and direct spiritual confrontation. In some narratives, the elder must confront the Wendigo, speaking ancient words of power to weaken its hold, creating a sacred space where the creature's frost cannot penetrate. The most poignant version of this end involves the ice heart. If a person can be reached before their transformation is complete, a powerful healer might perform a ritual to slowly melt the ice that has formed around their heart, painstakingly restoring their warmth and humanity. But if the change is final, the only mercy might be to shatter that frozen heart completely, ending the creature's suffering and freeing the land from its hunger. This reveals the ultimate truth about defeating a Wendigo. It is never just a physical contest, it is a restoration of balance. You are fighting the winter with warmth, fighting corruption with purity, fighting a fractured soul with wholeness. The methods teach that some evils cannot be punched or shot. They must be understood, confronted on their own terms, and spiritually overcome. This profound layer of the legend would soon face its greatest test, not in the mythic past, but in the stark daylight of the modern era, where the lines between spiritual sickness and criminal insanity would blur into a series of chilling, real-world cases. The legends of spiritual ice and winter hunger were about to collide with the cold, hard facts of a colonial courtroom. In the winter of 1878, a Cree trapper known as Swift Runner set up camp with his family near Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta. The snows were deep, the game was scarce, and the silence of the northern forest was absolute. By the following spring, only Swift Runner emerged from the woods. When he arrived at the Hudson's Bay Company trading post, he was not the gaunt, desperate figure the traders expected. He appeared healthy, even well-fed. His calm demeanor and unexplained sustenance raised immediate, terrible suspicions. The local Northwest Mounted Police were called, and they followed him back to his desolate camp. What they discovered there was a scene of profound horror. The remains of his wife and his 5 children were found, and the evidence was unmistakable. In a subsequent confession, Swift Runner admitted to the unthinkable. He had consumed his own family to survive. The colonial legal system saw a straightforward, if monstrous, case of murder and cannibalism. He was tried, convicted, and hanged in December of 1879. But within his own community and among those familiar with the old ways, the explanation was not so simple. Many believed Swift Runner was not merely a criminal, but a man who had been possessed by the Wendigo spirit. The harsh winter, the extreme famine, and his final, taboo act fit the ancient pattern perfectly. He had opened the door, and the spirit of endless hunger had walked in. This case forces a haunting question. Was Swift Runner a man who committed evil acts, or was he a victim of an evil that had already claimed him? The official records call it madness or depravity, but the legend suggests something else, a spiritual sickness that had reached its final, tragic stage. His story became a grim landmark, a point where folklore and true crime merged into a single, chilling narrative. It proved that the Wendigo was not just a story to warn children, but a framework to explain a darkness that was and is all too human. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, this framework would be examined through a new lens, not of spirit but of science, as Western medicine attempted to diagnose the monster. This collision of myth and reality demanded a new kind of language, one that tried to fit the Wendigo into a clinical box. In the early 20th century, anthropologists and psychiatrists began to document what they termed Wendigo psychosis. Scholars like Morton Tyker collected reports primarily from Algonquian communities in Canada of individuals exhibiting a specific and terrifying set of symptoms. These included an obsessive fear of turning into a Wendigo, a compulsive craving for human flesh, and episodes of extreme violence, often directed at family members. To Western science, this looked like a textbook example of a culture-bound syndrome, a unique mental illness shaped by specific cultural beliefs and the extreme environmental stress of famine. The theory was stark. The legend of the Wendigo was so powerful, so embedded in the collective psyche, that in times of severe starvation and psychological trauma, a person could literally believe they were becoming the monster, their mind manifesting the very symptoms the stories warned about. It was presented as a tragic feedback loop where folklore fueled psychosis, and psychosis seemed to confirm the folklore. This framework offered a secular, medical explanation for cases like swift runners, framing them not as spiritual possession, but as a severe psychiatric break with a culturally specific delusion. For a time, Wendigo psychosis became an accepted entry in the lexicon of cross-cultural psychology, a fascinating case study of how environment and belief could warp the human mind. But this clinical interpretation was built on a foundation of sand, and it would not hold. A powerful and necessary critique soon emerged, challenging the very premise of the diagnosis. Many Indigenous scholars and community knowledge keepers argued that labeling these experiences as psychosis was a profound act of colonial arrogance. It was, they contended, a fundamental misrepresentation and pathologization of a legitimate spiritual belief system. From an Algonquian perspective, the Wendigo is not a symptom of a sick mind. It is a real spiritual force, a dangerous entity that can indeed possess a person. To call that belief a delusion is to dismiss an entire worldview, to reduce a deep, sacred understanding of moral law and spiritual consequence to a mere mental malfunction. The debate cuts to the very heart of how we understand reality. Is the Wendigo a powerful story that can trigger insanity under duress, or is it a real spiritual danger that Western science, with its limited tools, simply refuses to see? The backlash against the Wendigo psychosis concept has been decisive in modern anthropology. Most contemporary scholars now recognize it as a product of its time, a well-intentioned but deeply flawed attempt to force an indigenous spiritual concept into a Western medical model. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of interpreting one culture's truths through another culture's lens. For the communities who have lived with this legend for centuries, the Wendigo remains what it always was, a solemn spiritual warning, not a psychiatric case file. This unresolved tension between the spiritual and the scientific leaves us with a haunting ambiguity, one that would only deepen as the Wendigo escaped the frozen north and found fertile new ground in the modern imagination. The colonial gaze saw a monster but missed the meaning entirely. When European missionaries and explorers first heard whispers of the Wendigo in the deep woods, they recorded it not as a profound spiritual lore, but as a bizarre native superstition. In the Jesuit relations, the detailed annual reports sent back to France in the 17th century, priests documented many Algonquian beliefs, often with a mix of anthropological curiosity and missionary condescension. They wrote of the Wendigo as a fearsome giant or a cannibal spirit, framing it within their own worldview as a demonic entity or a sign of pagan darkness. To these outsiders, the story was a sensational curiosity, a proof of the savage and terrifying world they believed they were there to tame and convert. Their pens captured the skeleton of the legend but left its soul behind. Fur trappers and frontier settlers, huddled in their isolated cabins through the punishing winters, absorbed these stories differently. For them, the Wendigo was not a spiritual concept but a very literal and immediate terror. They heard the same descriptions: the towering figure, the glowing eyes, the taste for human flesh, and they grafted it onto their own fears of the vast, unknown wilderness. In their diaries and letters, the Wendigo became another nameless horror in a land that already felt hostile and haunted, a convenient explanation for strange noises in the night or for travelers who never returned from the trapline. This colonial adoption performed a subtle but profound act of theft. By pulling the Wendigo out of its cultural and environmental context, they stripped it of its original purpose. The settlers feared the creature, but they did not understand the lesson it was meant to teach. They missed the critique of greed, the warning about community, the deep connection between the monster and the moral health of the people. Instead, they often fixated solely on the cannibalism, using that element to reinforce their own prejudices, to paint the indigenous cultures they were displacing as inherently brutal and primitive. The Wendigo, in their telling, became not a cautionary tale about what any human could become under duress, but a symbol of the savage other they feared. This distorted version was potent, however, and it stuck. It planted a seed in the North American imagination, a creepy campfire story divorced from its roots. This colonial fascination created a hollowed-out shell of the legend, one that was terrifying but spiritually empty, perfectly primed to be picked up by a new kind of storyteller. The stage was now set for the Wendigo to escape the frozen north and march into the pages of popular horror, where it would be reinvented once more, this time for a mass audience hungry for a new kind of monster. This deeper meaning transforms the Wendigo from a simple flesh eater into a profound moral mirror. Its hunger was never just about meat, it was a metaphor for any appetite that can never be satisfied. In the tight-knit communal societies of the Algonquian peoples, survival depended on sharing, on reciprocity, on understanding that the well-being of the individual was woven into the well-being of the group. To hoard food during a famine, to take more than your fair share from the hunt, to put your own desires above the needs of your family, these acts were seen as a kind of spiritual cannibalism. You were, in effect, consuming the life force of your community to feed your own selfishness. The Wendigo was the ultimate embodiment of that betrayal. Its endless craving for human flesh was a physical representation of a soul consumed by greed. This makes the legend startlingly modern. Look at the world around us today. What is unchecked consumerism, if not a societal Wendigo psychosis? It is the constant, insatiable hunger for more, newer, bigger, better, a cycle of consumption that devours resources, exploits labor, and leaves emptiness in its wake. The monster's heart of ice perfectly describes the cold logic of a system or a person that sees everything and everyone as fuel for its own growth. The colonial forces that later entered these forests, with their relentless drive to extract furs, timber, and land, operated with a Wendigo-like hunger, consuming without thought for balance or future generations. The legend, in its oldest form, was a warning against this very mindset. It taught that a person who takes without giving, who consumes without gratitude, who lets greed freeze their compassion, is walking the path to becoming a monster. The Wendigo thus escapes its snowy origins to haunt every era. It is the symbol of the billionaire hoarding wealth while others starve, the corporation strip mining a landscape for profit, the addiction that demands more and more while destroying the host. The freezing wind that follows the creature is the chill of isolation that comes when we prioritize possession over connection. So when we hear the old stories of the gaunt giant in the woods, we should ask ourselves an uncomfortable question. What are the hungers we feed today that can never be filled, and what parts of our own humanity might we be icing over in the process? The true terror of the Wendigo is not that it might be waiting out there in the dark, but that its seed might already be growing within the machinery of our world and within the quiet corners of our own hearts. The frozen giant of the Cree forests was not the only shape this ancient fear could take. Across the vast tapestry of Algonquian cultures and their neighbors, the core dread of winter and hunger manifested in different yet eerily familiar forms. This was never a single, copyrighted monster, but a powerful archetype that each community molded to fit its own landscape and lessons. Among the Algonquian peoples of the eastern woodlands, for instance, the Wendigo was sometimes less a physical beast and more an invisible spirit of famine. It was a malevolent force that could cause sickness, bring on a sudden, unseasonable frost to kill crops, or simply drain the vitality from a person, leaving them weak and wasting away. The threat was the same, the consumption of life, but its method was more subtle, a spectral sickness rather than a clawed attack. Travel further north and west into the territories of the Athabascan-speaking peoples, and you encounter a close cousin, the Wet'suge. Like the Wendigo, the Wet'suge is a transformed human, a person who has broken a fundamental taboo, often by committing acts of greed or violence against animals or the natural order. Once transformed, they become a cannibalistic giant, shambling and powerful, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The story serves a nearly identical social function, enforcing community laws and warning against the isolation and selfishness that the harsh environment punished so severely. Then, moving to the northeast, the Wabanaki peoples tell of the Chenyu. This creature is perhaps the most visually stark of all, described as a terrifying ice giant. A Chenyu is said to have a heart of solid ice, and its body is so cold that its touch can freeze a person solid. Legends tell of heroes confronting a Chenyu not with weapons but with cunning and compassion, sometimes tricking it into sitting by a fire until its icy heart melts, revealing the tormented human within. The similarities are profound, a being born of transgression, a heart turned to ice, and endless hunger. Yet the differences are just as important. They show how oral traditions are living things, adapting core human fears, the fear of starvation, of isolation, of losing one's humanity, to specific environments and social structures. A forest-dwelling people might envision a gaunt creature among the pines, while a coastal people might imagine a giant born from the freezing sea winds. This rich variation is not a sign of inconsistency, but of depth. It proves that the Wendigo and its kin are not simple plot devices, but profound cultural tools. They are flexible frameworks used to explain the unexplainable, to enforce necessary social codes, and to give a face to the very real, very human terror of being consumed, whether by the winter, by our own darkest impulses, or by the people we once called family. This archetype, so deeply rooted in the soil of North America, was about to be uprooted, polished, and repackaged for a world that had long forgotten the taste of true winter famine. The monster's journey from sacred warning to campfire tale was only the beginning. To truly embed itself in the modern mind, the Wendigo needed a new kind of storyteller, one who could translate its ancient chill into the language of popular horror. That storyteller arrived in the form of British author Algernon Blackwood, and in 1910 he unleashed a novella that would forever change the creature's destiny. His story, simply titled The Wendigo, did something remarkable. It captured the spirit of the legend while reshaping its body for a new audience. Blackwood moved the setting from the Algonquian homelands to the remote Canadian wilderness of northern Ontario, and his protagonists were not Indigenous hunters, but a group of European outdoorsmen, a doctor and a theologian among them, on a moose hunting expedition. This shift was crucial. It allowed the non-Indigenous reader to experience the terror firsthand, through the eyes of characters just as alien to the landscape as they were. In Blackwood's hands, the Wendigo itself is rarely seen. It is a presence, a sound, a smell of decay on the wind. Its most famous weapon is not a claw, but a call, the terrifying Wendigo call that lures one of the hunters, a man named Decoded, into the vast, indifferent wild. Decoded returns changed. He speaks of an ecstatic, horrifying flight over the treetops, of becoming one with a force far older and more savage than humanity. Blackwood masterfully translated the spiritual corruption of the original legend into a potent psychological and existential horror. His Wendigo is the wilderness itself, awake and hungry, a force that does not just kill you, but shows you the terrifying insignificance of your own soul before consuming it. The horror is in the revelation, the understanding that the civilized mind is a thin veneer over a primordial abyss. This was not a monster you could shoot, it was an idea that could unmake you. Blackwood's interpretation was a landmark, cementing the Wendigo as a symbol of nature's sublime and terrifying otherness for generations of horror readers. Other writers soon followed, weaving the creature into new and darker tapestries. August Derleth, a prolific writer and co-founder of the Cthulhu mythos with H.P. Lovecraft, saw a natural kinship between the ancient Algonquian spirit and the cosmic horrors of Lovecraft's universe. In Derleth's stories, the Wendigo became another one of the countless alien entities that lurk at the edges of human understanding, often serving the greater powers of the mythos. This was another kind of transformation, lifting the Wendigo from a regional folk spirit to a player on a global, even cosmic, stage of horror. While this further divorced the creature from its original cultural context, it amplified its reach, introducing the name and its associated dread to readers who might never have encountered Blackwood's work. Through these literary journeys, the Wendigo's core themes were distilled and amplified for a mainstream audience: the psychological unraveling, the terror of the wild, the horror of transformation. The frozen giant of the North had successfully invaded the bookshelf, but its greatest infiltration was yet to come. As the 20th century progressed, it would find an even more powerful medium, one that could give it a face, a voice, and a place in the living rooms of millions. Blackwood's literary monster was a ghost in the machine, waiting for the screen to give it a body. The Wendigo's migration to film and television began, as many horror stories do, in the realm of low-budget B-movies. Early cinematic portrayals often treated the creature as little more than a generic, cannibalistic caveman or a fur-covered beast man. These films stripped away every layer of meaning, reducing a profound spiritual warning to a simple, snarling antagonist in a rubber suit, driven by a hunger that was physical, not existential. The cultural roots were ignored, the environmental symbolism was lost, and the Wendigo became just another monster in a long line of creatures to be defeated by the hero in the final reel. This was the first and most common failure of adaptation, taking a name and a superficial trait while abandoning the soul of the legend entirely. Yet amidst this sea of forgettable creature features, a few notable appearances managed to capture a sliver of the old terror. The television series Supernatural, in its very first season, dedicated an episode to the creature. Titled simply Wendigo, the episode was notable for its restraint. The monster was rarely seen fully, presented instead as a fast, pale blur in the darkness of the woods, using stealth and speed to pick off campers. While the show still framed it as a monster of the week to be hunted, its portrayal emphasized the creature's unnatural abilities and its connection to a harsh, remote landscape, tapping into the primal fear of being prey in your own environment. A more ambitious attempt came with independent filmmaker Larry Fessenden's 2001 film Wendigo. Fessenden moved the setting to a snowbound weekend retreat for a stressed New York family. His approach was atmospheric and psychological, focusing on the tension within the family and the haunting local legends told by the rural residents. The creature itself is ambiguous, possibly a real supernatural force, possibly a manifestation of a young boy's trauma and fear. The film smartly played with the idea of the Wendigo as a psychological contagion, a story that infects the mind and shapes reality. It was a step towards treating the legend with a kind of eerie respect, even if it still centered an outsider's perspective. The central critique of nearly all mainstream film and television portrayals, however, holds firm. They consistently fail to engage with the cultural and spiritual depth of the Algonquian legend. The Wendigo is almost always used as a stock cannibal monster, a convenient plot device devoid of its original context as a critique of greed, a symbol of spiritual possession, or a lesson in communal survival. This reduction is a form of cultural flattening, taking a rich, specific tradition and sanding it down until it fits a generic horror template. But a new wind is beginning to blow through the pop culture forest. A recent and vital trend is the emergence of portrayals crafted by Indigenous creators themselves. Films and series like Blood Quantum, Trickster, and episodes of anthology shows written and directed by Indigenous filmmakers are beginning to reintroduce the Wendigo on their own terms. In these stories, the creature is often re-embedded in its cultural context, its appearance tied to historical trauma, broken treaties, and the ongoing consequences of colonialism. The hunger it represents is not just for flesh, but for land, for identity, for justice. This shift is crucial. It represents the monster being taken back by the communities who understand its true weight, transforming it from a cheap scare into a powerful metaphor for very real, ongoing struggles. The journey from sacred story to B-movie villain to a symbol reclaimed is perhaps the Wendigo's most modern transformation, proving that even a legend born of ice and hunger can adapt, survive, and find new ways to speak a terrifying truth. The monster's journey into our homes was not complete until it became something we could control or desperately try to escape. Video games and comics offered the Wendigo a new kind of life, one where its horror was not just observed but directly experienced. In these interactive and graphic realms, the creature found fresh power, often stripped of its cultural weight but amplified for pure, visceral terror. One of its most iconic modern appearances came in the cinematic horror game Until Dawn. Here, the Wendigos are not solitary spirits, but an entire population of feral, cannibalistic creatures haunting a remote mountain. The game's designers crafted a unique and chilling biology for them, explaining their existence through a fictional mineral psychosis, but the core traits remain unmistakable. They are blindingly fast, moving in jerking, insectile bursts. They are utterly silent until they strike, and their hunger is absolute. The game brilliantly leverages the creature's most frightening aspects, turning the player's helplessness into the main source of fear. You cannot fight them, you can only hide, hold your breath, and hope your flickering flashlight does not catch the glint of a pale, emaciated limb in the darkness. Until Dawn's Wendigos are masterclasses in atmospheric horror, capturing the primal dread of being hunted by something faster, stronger, and utterly alien in its hunger. Other games have adopted the name for different kinds of threats. In Fallout 76, a Wendigo appears as a mutated, screeching creature, a product of the game's nuclear wasteland rather than ancient folklore, yet it retains the themes of consumption and transformation. Even the fantasy tabletop realm of Dungeons & Dragons lists the Wendigo as a towering, icy fae creature that haunts frozen lands, a challenge for adventurers to battle with sword and spell. In all these digital and dice-rolled arenas, the Wendigo is primarily a boss monster, a stat block, a terrifying obstacle to overcome through combat or cunning. The spiritual nuance is often lost, but the raw, animalistic fear it provokes is very much intact. This translation into a combat-ready foe found a perfect home in the pages of Marvel Comics. Here, the Wendigo was reimagined as a specific and brutal curse. According to Marvel lore, the transformation is triggered by an act of cannibalism in the Canadian wilderness, after which the victim becomes a massive, fur-covered beast of immense strength and perpetual hunger. This curse has ensnared some of Marvel's most iconic characters. In one famous story arc, both Wolverine and the Hulk separately transformed into Wendigos, pitting the two powerhouses against each other in a battle of unstoppable force against unbreakable rage. The comic book version leans heavily into the body horror of the transformation and the tragic loss of control, themes that resonate with the original legend's idea of possession. While the portrayal is firmly in the realm of superhero action, it occasionally touches on the pathos of the curse, the human mind trapped within a monstrous form, raging against its own endless appetite. This highlights a common thread across games and comics. The Wendigo is almost always adapted into a powerful, bestial antagonist. The focus is on the action and the horror of the encounter, the fight for survival. Yet, by preserving the core trigger of cannibalism and the theme of involuntary transformation, these mediums sometimes manage to tap into a deeper vein of the myth. They remind us that the monster was once a person, and that the line between hero and horror can be terrifyingly thin. The creature's icy heart and spiritual warning may be softened, but its capacity to embody our fear of becoming the beast remains a potent and marketable kind of magic. This commercial adoption, however, stands in stark contrast to a much older, more solemn relationship, one where the Wendigo is not a villain to be slain, but a teacher whose lessons are still urgently needed. But for the communities who have carried this story for generations, the Wendigo is not a toy for the horror aisle. It is a living language, a way to speak truths that are too heavy for ordinary words. Today, a powerful movement is underway as Indigenous creators reclaim the narrative, not to sanitize it but to restore its profound and unsettling power. They are taking the Wendigo back from the realm of generic monsters and returning it to its roots as a tool for understanding deep, contemporary wounds. Author Eden Robinson, who is Haisla and Heiltsuk, masterfully weaves these threads in her novel Monkey Beach. While not featuring a literal Wendigo, the book is saturated with its spirit, a creeping sense of haunting and hunger tied to the trauma of colonialism, residential schools, and the loss of cultural memory. The monsters in her work are often the unresolved past and the predatory forces, both human and supernatural, that feed on a community's pain. This is the Wendigo archetype reframed, its hunger representing the consumption of land, language, and identity. This reclamation is blossoming across media. The anthology Talk to Me, published by the Inuit-owned Inhabit Media, presents a collection of Arctic horror stories written by Indigenous authors. Here, the fears are born from the land and ice itself, and the entities that emerge are inextricably linked to the environment and cultural knowledge. These stories understand that the truest horror often comes from broken relationships with the land, with ancestors, and within communities themselves. On screen, this shift becomes even more vivid. The television series Trickster, based on Eden Robinson's novels, presents a world where traditional spirits and dangerous, shape-shifting beings are part of the fabric of a modern, struggling community. These beings are not random invaders, they are manifestations of historical and ongoing trauma, of the chaos that follows when cultural foundations are shaken. Even in broader horror anthologies, Indigenous perspectives are carving new space. The segment titled The Body in the film The Mortuary Collection features a Dene filmmaker and actor, and while not a Wendigo story per se, it centers on an Indigenous protagonist confronting a predatory entity, weaving in themes of cultural connection and resilience against a consuming evil. What unites these modern interpretations is a restoration of complexity. The Wendigo and its kin are no longer simple villains to be slain. In these hands, the creature becomes a multifaceted metaphor. It can represent the insatiable hunger of resource extraction, the corporations that act like Wendigos, consuming entire landscapes and leaving behind a spiritual frost. It can embody the chilling legacy of intergenerational trauma, a coldness passed down through families that must be consciously melted. Most importantly, it speaks to cultural survival, to the fierce act of remembering and retelling stories as a way to defy the forces that would consume a people's identity. This is not entertainment that merely scares you. It is storytelling that challenges you to see the real monsters operating in our world and to recognize the ancient, powerful stories that have always known how to name them. That ancient warning against consuming your own kind now echoes on a planetary scale. The Wendigo's endless hunger finds its perfect modern counterpart in the relentless machinery of extraction. We call it logging, mining, and drilling, but from the perspective of the old stories, it is a familiar pattern, a force that takes without giving, consumes without gratitude, and leaves a permanent chill in its wake. Some indigenous scholars and activists have given this force a precise and chilling name: Wendigo economics. This framework sees the global industrial system not as progress, but as a form of spiritual possession, driven by the same insatiable appetite that defines the monster. The creature craved human flesh, but this system craves forests, mountains, rivers, and oil, devouring them with a speed and single-mindedness that mirrors the legends. A clear-cut forest where every tree is taken and the soil is left barren is a landscape consumed. A mountain removed for its coal is a body stripped to the bone. The Wendigo's heart of ice becomes the cold logic of a spreadsheet that values quarterly profits over the life of a watershed or the health of a community for generations to come. This is the allegory made terrifyingly real. The monster's association with unnatural cold and sterility transforms into a symbol for the consequences of this consumption: climate change itself. The Wendigo brought a localized blizzard, but our industrial hunger has unleashed a global one, melting the ice caps not with warmth, but with a feverish imbalance while creating ecological deserts, places stripped of biodiversity and warmth. The pollution that chokes a river, the acid rain that kills a lake, these are the modern equivalents of the spiritual frost that followed the creature, leaving lifelessness behind. So when the old stories speak of cannibalism, they were pointing to a profound truth: to consume the very things that sustain you is a path to self-destruction. On a global scale, humanity is now engaged in a form of planetary cannibalism. We are consuming the ecosystems, the clean air, the stable climate that are the foundational flesh and blood of our own survival. The monstrous consequence is not a single gaunt figure in the woods, but a rising sea, a burning forest, a destabilized world. The Wendigo myth, in its oldest form, was a lesson in balance and reciprocity. It taught that taking more than you need, especially from your communal web of life, invites a curse. That lesson was meant for a family group in a hard winter, but its scale has exploded to encompass all of humanity on a fragile planet. The creature's warning was always about the cost of unchecked appetite. Today, that appetite has a corporate logo, a stock ticker, and a devastating footprint. The question the legend forces us to ask is no longer about a monster in the dark, but about the monstrous systems we have built in the light, and whether we possess the spiritual tools, the ancient wisdom, to melt the ice at the heart of our own civilization before the final winter sets in. The search for a physical beast is a modern kind of hunger. In recent decades, the Wendigo has been pulled into the world of cryptozoology, joining the ranks of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster as a creature some believe can be tracked, photographed, and catalogued. Online forums and amateur investigation groups buzz with reports, primarily from the dense forests of Minnesota, northern Ontario, and around the Great Lakes. Witnesses describe fleeting glimpses of a pale, emaciated figure moving between the pines, or the discovery of strange, bipedal footprints in the snow that seem too large and too deep for any known animal. The evidence, as it often is in these pursuits, is tantalizingly vague. There are the blurry, dark photographs where a twisted tree stump or a trick of shadow might be interpreted as a skeletal form. There are audio recordings purported to capture the Wendigo's call, a high, piercing shriek or an unnerving guttural moan that cuts through the night silence, sending chills down the spine of anyone who listens. Enthusiasts analyze these clues with fervent dedication, mapping sighting clusters and debating the creature's potential biology, its diet, its nesting habits. This approach frames the Wendigo as an undiscovered species, a rare and dangerous animal that has simply eluded scientific classification. It transforms the ancient spirit into a puzzle to be solved, a trophy to be captured on camera. But this very act of hunting for a physical body creates a profound disconnect. It treats the Wendigo as a mere animal, a biological entity separate from us. This perspective entirely misses the spiritual and moral core of the Algonquian legend. The Wendigo was never an animal you could find, it was a state of being you could fall into. Its danger was not in its claws, but in its origin story, a story about the human capacity for corruption when pushed by greed or desperation. To search for it with night vision goggles and footprint casts is to reduce a profound spiritual warning to a campfire scare, a ghost story made literal for entertainment. This tension defines much of our modern engagement with folklore. We are often more comfortable with monsters we can potentially trap than with metaphors that might trap us. The cryptozoological hunt offers a clear narrative, a mystery with a potential solution. The spiritual understanding offers a far more unsettling and personal challenge, a mirror held up to our own appetites and the icy places in our own souls. So the next time you see a grainy photo labeled possible Wendigo sighting, ask yourself a different question. Is the seeker looking for a monster in the woods, or are they avoiding the one the story truly warns us about, the one that might be much, much closer to home? The deepest fear the Wendigo represents may not be of an external beast, but of the one we each carry inside. From a psychological perspective, this creature steps out of the frozen forest and into the landscape of the human mind, becoming a powerful symbol for our own repressed darkness. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung spoke of the shadow self, the part of our personality that contains all the traits we deem unacceptable, our rage, our greed, our most primal and selfish instincts. We try to bury these impulses to keep them locked away in the cold. The Wendigo is that shadow, fully unleashed and given monstrous form. Its endless physical hunger becomes a metaphor for any psychological appetite that spirals out of control. Think of addiction, where a craving for a substance or a behavior consumes every other aspect of life, hollowing out relationships and identity until only the need remains. That is the Wendigo's curse in a modern skin, a hunger that devours the host. Or consider a destructive obsession with power, wealth, or status, a gluttony of the ego that freezes empathy and turns other people into mere objects to be used and discarded. This is the insatiable idea, the part of our psyche driven solely by pleasure and desire, running rampant without the balance of conscience or community. The transformation into the monster is a perfect allegory for the loss of self we witness when someone is consumed by these forces. It is not a sudden change, but a gradual chilling of the soul. A person in the grip of addiction or rage often describes feeling like a passenger in their own body, watching as their actions betray their values, as their humanity is steadily eroded by a craving they cannot master. The heart turns to ice not in a single moment, but through 1,000 small compromises, each one sacrificing a piece of warmth and connection. This psychological interpretation unlocks a universal, deeply personal layer of the legend. We may never face a famine in the woods, but we all wrestle with our own hungers, our own potential for self-destruction. The Wendigo externalizes that internal battle. It gives a face to the terrifying question, what would I become if I stopped fighting those impulses, if I let the greed or the anger or the bottomless need take the wheel? This makes the monster perversely relatable. Its terror is not in its otherness, but in its familiarity. We recognize the seed of it within ourselves. This psychological dimension does not replace the spiritual or cultural meanings. Instead, it braids together with them. A spiritual possession and a psychological breakdown can look eerily similar, both describing a self that has been overthrown by a force it cannot contain. The cultural warning against cannibalism and the psychological warning against the consumptive self are two sides of the same coin. Both are about the annihilation that comes from feeding the wrong kind of hunger. So the Wendigo endures not just as a folk monster, but as a timeless piece of narrative therapy. It is a story that allows us to project our deepest fears about ourselves onto a figure in the snow, to examine them from a safe distance, and to remember the vital cost of losing control. The creature's true haunting ground is not the pine forest, but the shadowy terrain of our own choices, waiting to see what we will feed and what we will starve. Facing this spiritual corruption required a wisdom as deep as the winter itself. The communities who lived with the legend did not see themselves as helpless. They possessed a profound and practiced system of spiritual medicine, a set of rituals designed to protect, to diagnose, and when necessary, to banish. This was not a collection of random superstitions, but a holistic approach to health, treating the soul with the same seriousness as the body. At the first sign of trouble, when the air felt too still or a person began acting strangely cold and withdrawn, the community would act. One of the first lines of defense was collective ceremony. The people would gather, often around a central fire, for drumming and singing. The steady, resonant beat of the drum was believed to be the heartbeat of the earth, a powerful, unifying rhythm that strengthened the spiritual bonds between everyone present. The songs were not mere melodies, they were prayers and stories given voice, weaving a protective web of sound and shared intention. This communal act served a vital purpose. It reaffirmed the warmth and connection that the Wendigo spirit sought to freeze and shatter. In the face of a force that thrived on isolation, the community answered with unity. If the danger seemed more personal, if a specific individual showed the chilling signs of possession, the task fell to a specialized spiritual healer, often called a medicine person. Their role was akin to that of a doctor, a psychologist, and a priest combined. The first step was always diagnosis. Through prayer, meditation, and sometimes the use of sacred tools like divination with bones or stones, the healer would seek to understand the nature of the spiritual illness. Had the person been touched by the Wendigo spirit? Was it a fleeting influence or a deep possession? This discernment was critical, for the cure had to match the severity of the sickness. For early stages, the treatment might involve cleansing rituals. The healer could use the smoke of sacred herbs like sweetgrass or sage to purify the person's energy, brushing the fragrant smoke over their body with an eagle feather to carry the prayers upward. They might administer specially prepared teas from plants known for their strengthening or calming properties, treating the physical anxiety that accompanied spiritual dread. Protective charms were also common. A person might carry a small leather pouch, an amulet containing a mix of powerful items, perhaps a piece of cedar, a claw from a protective animal like a bear, or a small, smooth stone from a sacred site. These were not magic talismans in a fantasy sense. They were physical anchors for spiritual intention, constant reminders of the protective forces aligned with the wearer. But for a full, active possession, the rituals became more intense, focusing on direct confrontation and banishment. In these solemn ceremonies, the medicine person would enter a heightened spiritual state, calling upon helping spirits and ancestral guides for strength. The afflicted person might be brought to a specially prepared lodge or a secluded, sacred space. Through powerful chants, the shaking of rattles, and direct spiritual dialogue, the healer would work to confront the Wendigo spirit within the host. The goal was not to destroy the person, but to drive out the invasive corruption, to melt the ice around the heart and reclaim the human soul trapped inside. This was delicate, dangerous work, a battle fought on a plane invisible to most, where the healer's own spiritual fortitude was the primary weapon. Every element of these practices, from the communal drum circle to the healer's solitary prayer, served the same ultimate purpose: the restoration of balance. The Wendigo represented a catastrophic imbalance, an infinite hunger that consumed all warmth and connection. The rituals were the antidote, systematically rebuilding the warmth, reaffirming the connections, and repairing the spiritual integrity of both the individual and the community. They were a profound statement that no darkness, not even one as old and cold as winter, was beyond the reach of a people's collective will to heal. The canvas and the concert hall have become new hunting grounds for this ancient spirit. Visual artists have long been drawn to the Wendigo's stark, symbolic form, translating its bone-chilling essence into images that linger in the mind. Some of the earliest possible interpretations might be found in the ancient rock art of the northern woodlands, where petroglyphs depict elongated, skeletal figures that scholars suggest could represent spiritual concepts of famine or dangerous spirits. These cryptic images carved into stone are whispers from a deep past, a visual language for a fear as old as winter itself. Moving forward in time, illustrators for pulp magazines in the early 20th century seized on the creature's more sensational aspects, often portraying it as a hulking, furry beast man, emphasizing raw savagery over spiritual nuance. Yet modern artists have returned to the legend's core, creating digital and traditional pieces that capture its existential horror. You might see a painting where the Wendigo is less a solid creature and more a swirling vortex of snow and shadow, its skeletal limbs emerging from a blizzard, its eyes the only points of sickly light in a monochrome forest. Other artists focus on the tragic human element, depicting the moment of transformation, a face contorted in agony as the skin stretches taut over rising bones, or a figure looking at its own reflection in a frozen lake, watching its humanity dissolve. These works do not just illustrate a monster, they visualize the feeling of endless hunger, the isolation of a frozen heart, making the abstract terror painfully concrete. This same visceral inspiration flows powerfully into sound. In the realm of music, the Wendigo finds a natural home in genres built around atmosphere and extremity. Black metal, with its themes of misanthropy, nature's indifference, and raw existential dread, embraces the legend completely. Bands like the Canadian group Wedrugesy Wyatta or the American act Woe use the Wendigo not just as a lyrical topic but as a guiding aesthetic. The music itself becomes an auditory landscape. Shrieking vocals mimic the creature's infamous call, blistering guitar riffs evoke the sting of a frozen wind, and relentless, cold percussion mirrors a desperate flight across endless snow. The lyrics often explore the psychosis from within, portraying the narrator's descent into icy alienation or their transformation into the predator. In stark contrast, folk and neo-folk musicians approach the legend with a quieter, more haunting reverence. Artists like Sean James sing songs titled simply Wendigo, using acoustic instrumentation, mournful melodies, and narrative storytelling to recount the tale's tragic arc. The focus here is on the story and the moral, the slow freeze of the soul, the price of the taboo. The creature becomes a folk ballad warning, its story passed down not around a campfire but through speakers and headphones. Specific albums have built entire worlds around this myth. The progressive metal band The Native Howl has a track called Wendigo that blends frantic banjo with thrashing metal, a sonic metaphor for the clash between folk tradition and modern horror. In the world of soundtrack composition, the creature's influence is felt in scores for horror games and films, where composers use dissonant strings, deep drones, and sudden silences to create a sense of being watched by something ancient and hungry. What unites these musical interpretations, from the abrasive to the acoustic, is the successful translation of the legend's core emotions into pure atmosphere. The music makes you feel the isolation, the creeping cold, the predatory tension. It proves that the Wendigo is more than a character. It is a mood, a palette of dread that artists can use to explore our deepest anxieties about the wild, the self, and the darkness that beckons from both. This ongoing creative conversation, from stone carvings to streaming playlists, ensures the Wendigo is never frozen in the past but continually reborn, a timeless symbol finding new voices to carry its chilling warning into the future. The power of a story is measured by the care with which it is told. When the Wendigo steps out of its cultural homeland and into the global marketplace of ideas, a critical question emerges: who has the right to tell its story? This is the complex terrain of cultural appropriation, where a sacred narrative can be stripped of its meaning and repackaged as a generic horror commodity. We have seen it happen time and again. A non-Indigenous filmmaker or game developer lifts the name and the cannibalistic trait, but leaves behind the spiritual depth, the environmental warning, and the profound connection to Algonquian lore. The result is often a hollow shell, a monster used for a cheap jump scare, which can feel not just creatively lazy, but deeply disrespectful to the communities for whom this is a living, solemn tradition. It treats a piece of spiritual heritage as if it were public domain, free for anyone to use without context or consequence. The line between appreciation and appropriation is drawn by intention and understanding. Appreciation seeks to learn, to honor the context, and to acknowledge the source. It understands that some stories are not just entertainment, they are carriers of identity, history, and survival. Appropriation, on the other hand, simply takes. It extracts the compelling symbol while ignoring its roots, often for profit or prestige, without permission, without partnership, and without a thought for the people who nurtured that story through generations of hardship. So how can a creator engage with a legend like the Wendigo ethically? The path forward is built on respect and relationship. It begins with consultation, actively seeking out and listening to the cultural knowledge keepers from the communities where the story originates. This is not about finding a single person to rubber stamp an idea, but about entering a dialogue, understanding the legend's gravity, and learning what elements are considered sacred or sensitive. Ethical storytelling means moving beyond the monster as a mere villain. It involves grappling with the themes the legend actually presents, the critiques of greed, the warnings about isolation, the spiritual understanding of hunger. It means avoiding the reduction of a profound cultural concept to a simple cannibal in the woods. Importantly, Indigenous communities themselves are leading the way in asserting control over their narratives. Organizations and initiatives are working to formalize protocols for the use of traditional knowledge, treating stories, symbols, and ceremonies as intellectual and cultural property that deserves protection. They are creating their own media, from films to podcasts to novels, to tell these stories on their own terms. For audiences, this invites a more thoughtful engagement. When we encounter a Wendigo in a movie or a game, we can ask questions. Does this portrayal feel respectful? Does it seem to understand the story's origins, or is it just using a cool name? Our curiosity and our choices as viewers can encourage more responsible storytelling. The Wendigo's journey from sacred warning to pop culture icon holds a mirror up to our own consumption. It asks us to consider not just what stories we enjoy, but who owns them, what they truly mean, and what is lost when we take without understanding. The legend's ultimate hunger, it seems, might be for the respect it is so often denied. This monster's power lies in its profound simplicity. The Wendigo endures because it speaks to fears that are primal, universal, and uncomfortably close to the bone. Its first and most fundamental terror is the fear of starvation. This is not the mild hunger of a missed meal, but the desperate, gnawing void that can unravel a mind. In our modern world of abundance, we have insulated ourselves from this raw biological terror, but the memory of it is written deep in our DNA. The Wendigo is that memory given a gaunt, skeletal form, a walking reminder that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, we are all just a few missed harvests or a broken supply chain away from that abyss. It makes the abstract horror of famine personal, immediate, and monstrous. closely linked is the fear of losing our humanity, of becoming something less than human. The Wendigo's origin story is a tragedy of transformation. A person, through desperation or moral failure, crosses a line and is irrevocably changed. This taps into a deep anxiety about the fragility of our own identity. What are the lines we might cross under enough pressure? What parts of ourselves might we sacrifice to survive or to get what we crave? The creature shows us the grotesque endpoint of that journey, a being that looks vaguely human but has been hollowed out, its compassion and connection replaced by a heart of ice and a single, all-consuming purpose. This leads directly to the third fear, the fear of the hostile, indifferent wilderness. Unlike European monsters that haunt castles or crypts, the Wendigo is a child of the North American forest. Its home is the vast, silent expanse of pine and snow, a landscape that can be breathtakingly beautiful and utterly merciless. The legend validates that ancient, instinctual dread of the wild places, the sense that the trees themselves are watching, and that something within that ecosystem does not want you there. It gives a name and a shape to the feeling of being a small, warm anomaly in a cold, uncaring world. Finally, and perhaps most powerfully, the Wendigo embodies the fear of the monster we could become. This is what separates it from a vampire or a werewolf. Those creatures are often afflicted by an external bite or curse, something that happens to them. The Wendigo, however, is almost always a consequence of choice. It is the monster born from within, from a human act of transgression. We are not just afraid of meeting it, we are afraid of becoming it. This internalizes the horror, making it a moral and psychological specter that haunts our own choices and capacities. Its adaptability is its genius. The same framework that once warned against cannibalism in a time of famine now perfectly frames the insatiable hunger of consumerism, the cold logic of exploitation, or the spiritual emptiness of greed. It is a symbol that can stretch to fit both ancient taboos and modern anxieties because its core components, hunger, cold, and corruption, are timeless. The Wendigo is not fading into history because it was never just a story about the past. It is a dark reflection, a perfect storm of environmental, spiritual, and psychological horror. It holds up a cracked, icy mirror and forces us to ask what we are truly hungry for and what we are willing to freeze inside ourselves to get it. The chill we feel is not just from the legend, it is the recognition of a truth buried deep within the snow and deep within us. From a sacred warning whispered in the frozen pines to a symbol flashing on our screens, the Wendigo's journey is a map of our own deepest fears. It began as a spiritual law among the Algonquian peoples, a personification of winter's hunger and the ultimate taboo, teaching that to consume your own community is to invite a curse upon your soul. It echoed in the grim, historical silence of lonely cabins and colonial courtrooms, where folklore and true crime blurred into one chilling story. It was dissected by science, misunderstood by settlers, and reborn in the pages of horror novels and the pixels of video games, often stripped of its meaning but never of its power. Today, it stands as a stark mirror, reflecting our own world's insatiable hungers, the greed that consumes landscapes and the cold logic that freezes compassion. The Wendigo is far more than a monster. It is a profound cultural teaching, a narrative tool that has weathered centuries because its core truth is timeless. It tells us that the greatest dangers are not always external, but can grow from within, from the appetites we choose to feed. So we are left with that final, unsettling question, one that the legend has been asking all along. In a world of endless consumption, what are we truly hungry for, and what, in our relentless pursuit of it, might we become? Share your thoughts on this enduring legend in the comments below, and if you want to explore more mysteries rooted in the land and its stories, be sure to subscribe. Remember, the oldest warnings often carry the sharpest truth.